Okay, so the nervous system, right, consists of the brain and also the spinal cord. Those two comprise the central nervous system, or the CNS. And the brain, of course, you can subdivide into the cerebrum and the cerebellum, where most of the neurons are actually located in the brain, and the brain stem, right? So the brain and the spinal cord are the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, consists of the nerves. Basically the afferent component of nerves, right? The sensory input component of nerves, that are carrying touch and injury information and pressure information, and what's called proprioception, like your sense of where your muscles are extended, etc. From the body, sort of back into the brain, and also the efferent, or the motor output component, basically, of those nerves. The motor commands to move muscles and really, largely engage in various, aspects of behavior. And in the peripheral nervous system, there's also clumps, right, of neurons, of like synaptic connectivity between cells, where cells are synapsing with each other, right? And there's all sorts of interneurons and other neurons here, and these are called ganglia. So CNS, brain, spinal cord, right? By virtue of its structural position, we know that the brain is really important for a lot of complex psychological operations, processes, abilities, skills, social decision making, various aspects of perception, language comprehension and production, memory, all these things. The spinal cord, is critically involved in the transfer of, afferent information up, to the brain, and efferent information out, to the body. And the peripheral nervous system is, where the motor movements actually occur, right? And, is gathering lots of information, about what's happening in these bodies, in which we live. Now, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are separated from each other, or bound. There's a separation, like a boundary between them. And there's really sort of two distinct kind of barriers, between CNS and PNS. The first is a very clear sort of physical boundary. It's a series of membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord, so that the central nervous system components, the brain and the spinal cord, are within, this series of membranes, which are collectively called the meninges, while the peripheral nervous system, the ganglia and the afferent and efferent nerves, are outside of the meninges. The meninges are actually quite fascinating. If you ever get an opportunity to observe a brain surgery, and through our outreach work with Northwest Noggin, we've taken students from Portland State, actually, and other area campuses, to actually witness a brain surgery at a local hospital. And when they have to get into the brain, right, you got to go through the skull, but then below it you see very quickly this kind of glistening, leathery, tough, kind of membrane. That's actually called the tough mother. It's the dura mater. It's the first of the three meningeal layers which surround the brain and spinal cord and separate the CNS, from the PNS. And within that tough mother, or that dura mater, is fluid. So subdural, you've got fluid. It's called cerebrospinal fluid because it flows around between the brain and the spinal cord. Now, below the dura mater is this other membrane. It's called a membrane. It's another layer of the meninges that really becomes apparent when you're observing an actual brain surgery, because it tends to collapse once the fluid is out, in a cadaver brain. And so in the actual, in you right now and in me right now, there's like these extraordinary, glistening, rather beautiful, grayish, silvery kind of cables that link up the dura to a series of blood vessels that surround the brain and spinal cord. This vasculature is kind of hanging suspended by these little spider-like cables that are attached to the dura on the outside and attached to the innermost layer of the meninges, which lies directly on top of the cerebrum, which is called the pia mater, which means soft mother. So there's 3 meningeal layers that separate the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, from the peripheral nervous system, the nerves, both afferent and efferent, and also the ganglia that are found in the PNS. And these include the tough outer dura mater, and then the silvery, vasculature suspended, filaments of the arachnoid layer, which is named because arachnoid means spider, and the innermost soft mother, which directly covers over the brain and the spinal cord. Now, there's another important separation or barrier between the brain and spinal cord, the components of the central nervous system, and the nerves and the ganglia that are linked to the PNS or found in the PNS, and that's what's known as the blood-brain barrier. And it is exactly what you would imagine. It's a barrier between the blood and the brain, and also, it turns out, the spinal cord, because it's found in the CNS. And it's actually the barrier itself is on the actual vasculature, the walls of the vasculature, the cells that make up, the capillaries, which are these very small vessels that carry, blood and other nutrients and oxygen, basically, throughout the body and the brain. The actual cells that make up those capillaries, those tubes, look different in the peripheral nervous system than they do in the central nervous system. They present more of a barrier, it turns out, between blood and brain, when you're in the CNS. And to give a little sense, you've got a heart which pumps blood, right? And it pumps, oxygenated blood out this great big vessel called the aorta, which then splits into a big, tube that goes down to feed the body, and another tube that goes up, that's going to feed the brain. And basically, if you can feel right here, you can feel this beating of the common carotid arteries. These are carrying oxygenated blood, and then they're going to split into an external carotid, which will feed the head and face, and then an internal carotid, which will go, branch into additional, arteries that'll feed the cerebrum and the brain. And, these arteries, which are carrying oxygenated blood, are going to split into smaller branches that are called arterioles, which will split into smaller branches, which are called capillaries. And at the capillary level, in the peripheral nervous system, the cells that actually form the tubes through which your blood travels and other, important constituents in the blood, like oxygen and glucose and amino acids and things like that, the cells are kind of loosely adhered to each other. So the plumbing, the tubes that carry blood around to tissues in your body, is rather leaky. It's got holes so that things can actually diffuse across, both leave tissues into the blood and go from the blood into the tissues. But because of signals that come from, chemical signals that are released from some of these support cells in the central nervous system, some of these glial cells, actually, the capillary cells that form the walls of the capillaries, that form the tubes, the plumbing in the brain and the spinal cord and the central nervous system, tightly adhere to each other, or more tightly adhere to each other. They form what they call tight junctions. So the plumbing in your brain and spinal cord is less leaky than the plumbing in your body. And this has, some very important aspects, right? Because it helps to protect the brain and spinal cord from things that might be of some danger which are traveling in the blood, like some viruses, for example, or some bacteria, or potentially some drugs or some poison, something that you've consumed that has difficulty crossing from the blood into the brain. It has difficulty crossing the blood-brain barrier. The body is less protected. The peripheral nervous system is less protected than the CNS.